Well, I truly believe that we as a congregation have been blessed. People are growing in their faith. We have 2 men's Bible studies. We have multiple women's Bible studies, I think 3 in total. We have our youth programming. We have our multi-generational programming. Our Life Tree Cafe, people are connecting to each other and growing in their faith. And we are reaching out more and more so to the world. We're about ready to make our first trip to Chile, a mission trip. And do you realize how much you guys raised for that trip? I think right now it stands at around $5,000. And we haven't even added yet the money raised by the Women Wings Group with their quilt, which, by the way, later we're going to go ahead and do the drawing for that. But as many blessings as we have had as a congregation, we are also a congregation of humans. And being humans, we are impacted by the frailty of our humanness. We have multiple members who are battling cancer. We have people with health problems, depression, financial difficulties. And then many of us impacted by the flu and the colds that have taken their toll over this winter season. And these are all opportunities for Satan to grab a receptive ear and to implant in our brains the question, does God really love you? Why would all of these things happen to you if God truly loved you? James, in our reading, is dealing with a similar issue. He's looking at the case of Christians who are going through trials. And he raises the question, what is God's involvement in trials? And does God tempt? Well, we have to realize that James actually is dealing with 2 very closely related words, but yet different words. And they are similar yet different. There is trial or test, and I'm going to use trial and test interchangeably, versus temptation. The differences are pretty slim, but there is a distinction. In fact, James tells us, he says, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test," and this is why I use them interchangeably, "he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him." Now, this is the ESV version. The NAS and the NIV also use the word trial. However, the King James, the KJG, and the NKJ translations use the word temptation instead for this verse. And the NLT actually uses testing and temptation. And now, to make things even more confusing, the next verse moves to the statement that God would never tempt anyone. It says in the ESV, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one." The interesting fact is that in the Greek, both of these verses, it's the same word. But even though it's the same word, even within the same translation, the ESV, in the one verse it's translated as test or trial, and the second verse it's translated as temptation. So very closely related Greek word, but it has a couple subtle differences that it can be used. And James seems to be making a distinction between these 2 what I would say English translations, trial versus temptation. So let us try to look at the nuanced difference between these 2. A temptation, obviously, as James tells us, is something that God would never do. But it is clear from Scripture that God is behind trials or tests. And our Old Testament is an example of that. Abraham was tested for his faith. He was asked to go and sacrifice his son, and God obviously stopped him before it happened. but it was a test. It's subtle, but yet there is a distinction. And maybe the difference between the two might best be explained by the desired goal of the two. The goal of temptation is to cause people to sin. The goal of a trial is to build character and to test and to strengthen faith. And so as you look at the goal of a test versus a temptation, I think James' words begin to make more sense. God would never tempt. Why would God want us to sin when his unchangeable goal is for us that we might be mature, having the character of highest quality? While God often tests our faith, our maturity is God's goal. And he would never work to encourage us to sin. A God who tempts believers to sin cannot achieve his goal of mature believers. In fact, not only can God not tempt us, but he can't even be tempted to consider the idea of tempting us. We look at the verse. It says, "For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one." The idea of God tempting us to sin is absolutely repulsive to him and totally contrary to his nature. But yes, God does use trials to cause us to grow. You might ask the question about Job. This is another example of suffering and trials. And for those of you not familiar with Job, Satan comes into the presence of God, and God praises Job for being so faithful. And Satan will just say, "Well, that's only because you have protected him and you've given him all these gifts. Let me at him. Let me take away a few of his gifts, and then we'll see if he continues to praise you." And so God allowed it. And Job ended up losing all of his possessions. He ended up losing his family. He ended up losing his health. And he did not curse God. He questioned God and was trying to understand why, he was going through this. What did he do to deserve this? But he did not curse God. And obviously, Job was tested. We could even say Job was tempted. So we can conclude that God apparently allows humans to be tempted by the forces of evil. In this case, he allowed Satan to do it, but God himself was not doing the tempting. And throughout it all, his goal and earnest desire is for us to escape the temptation. And that was definitely true for Job. I think one more clear example of this can be seen in the comment that Jesus made to Peter on Maundy, Thursday night, that night before Jesus died. And Jesus said to Peter, he said, "Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers." Apparently, Satan wanted to take Peter out. God could have protected Peter from experiencing this, but he didn't. He allowed Peter to be sifted. But Jesus was right there cheering him on. He said, "I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail." And so, yes, Peter had to go through the process. And it was going through this process that helped him to grow and to mature in his faith. And as a result, he became stronger. And he was to use his experience then to help strengthen his brothers and his sisters. So yes, this passage in James today gives us some insight into the subtle yet significant differences between trials and temptations. But it also helps us in understanding how temptation works to achieve its goal. I believe we're at the next slide. There we go. So not only is there temptation and testing that we learn, I'd like to move on to how Satan actually uses temptation to bring us into sin. Let us look at the verse. It says, "But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death." Look at those words, lured and enticed. In Greek, these are the technical terms for fishing, and the idea to get baited and then to reel them in. So all of you fishermen, these are fishing terminology, and you're very familiar with baiting and then reeling in. And so James envisions evil desires as a master fisherman, selecting just the right bait, and once it is taken, then to reel us in. And then James shifts to words of human development. It talks about giving birth, something that has happened recently. And this is not surprising, since James' main theme is spiritual maturity. But here James is not talking about the growth of the Christian in this giving birth, but rather the growth of desire. This desire is conceived and gives birth to sin, and then that sin grows into death. Did you ever try stopping a birth that was in progress? Yeah, you tried? Were you successful? Yes. It can be a little bit of a challenge, and so once this sin thing gets going, this desire, there is this birthing process that gets going and becomes very difficult. I would call this the proverbial slippery slope. And so James describes this slippery slope, and this isn't skiing at the Olympics, as desire, sin, and death. And the point is the desires for sin actually come within us. We call that original sin, or the depravity of man. We call it our old Adam, our sinful human nature. We are naturally prone to sin. Yes, as baptized believers, we have God's Spirit living within us that creates this battle with the sinful nature. But the point is the sinful nature is always present, and the temptation comes from within us. But I think we do have to realize that the desires themselves are not sinful. We have certain desires, that are part of who we are. I mean, we were created to be attracted to the opposite gender. And that in and of itself is not sinful. But that desire, if not controlled, can lead into sin. I would actually argue that the same is true in a certain way for same-sex attraction. I would argue that maybe the fact that someone has a desire itself may not be sinful. It may be a part of who someone is. I'll give the idea that maybe it is genetic, but that doesn't condone acting out on that. The desire may be there. I'm not going to condemn anyone for having that desire, but the question is what do we do with that desire? In fact, temptation is listening to that desire, giving in to that desire, allowing those thoughts to fester, a lust of any type, and then acting out on them. Actually, we don't even need to act out on them. Jesus says that lustful thoughts are just as bad as lustful actions. So when that desire flares up within us, we don't dwell on it. Rather, we think upon higher things. You know, many Christians feel they can allow evil desires and cravings to fester, thinking that they can divorce their thought life from the actions that they engage in. And I think this text says otherwise. Both the fishing language and the birthing metaphor tells us no. It very quickly can lead to death. You know, when a believer yields to temptation, it results in sin, and that sin will lead eventually to death. And you fishermen, as we've already noted, know the art of luring fish to do something that is not good for them. I would like to look at a different metaphor that shows this same point, and this is going to appeal more to you gardeners. And this is called the cobra lily, the story of the cobra lily. And hopefully we can get the video to run where we need to. Let's take a look. This is actually a carnivorous plant, eats insects. We may need to turn our sound back on. Is our sound turned off? Yeah, I think we were getting some sound coming through that.
Not a lily at all. It's a pitcher plant. Prey are attracted to Darlingtonia pitchers because they think that the pitcher is a flower. And in fact, on the fangs of the pitcher, there's a lot of nectar. The insects eat the nectar, and as they browse around, they ultimately climb into the underside of the pitcher where they find themselves in a big chamber. They can't figure out how to get out. To add to their confusion, the top of the chamber is illuminated by fenestrations, these clear windows in the top of the pitcher. The insect runs back and forth, until it makes a mistake. It drops down the descending pitcher tube. Downward pointing hairs ensure that the insect can't escape, and the insect ultimately drowns in the fluid in the bottom. It turns out that cobra lilies don't act.
So when an insect, it just randomly wanders in, it's enticed to come in, and it is dazzled by the light show that it finds inside. And then eventually it is totally disoriented and slowly crawls forward down a path with thousands of fine hairs. And when it tries to turn back, it realizes it's in trouble and tries to turn back, it finds it is too late. When we let our desires go unchecked, the same thing can happen. Sin looks so alluring, so enticing. We just want to check it out. But then we become dazzled with it, and we soon become disoriented. And we make decisions in our disorientation that we regret. And yes, this also can lead to death and destruction. Do not be deceived. That is James' closing message for us today. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Those words, do not be deceived, are telling it. It highlights the fact that doubting the goodness of God is easy to do. Therefore, don't be deceived. You know, we often think of God being neutral, sitting back and judgmental and waiting to see whether we pass or fail the test. But when God tests our faith through trials, it is only because he longs for us to succeed and actually works toward that end by giving us good gifts. And he gives us these good gifts even in the midst of the temptations that we are going through or the trials that we are going through. While we are often confused and uncertain during our trials and temptations, God is unwavering in his single purpose to create in us a new people who will praise his name. May it be so in Jesus' name. Amen.